In data visualization, there are many opportunities to add interaction in the form of selecting one thing from a list, and that can be done using a menu. We'll discuss the Select HTML element, populating its options with D3, listening for changes, state management with Unidirectional Data Flow, changing the font size, centering with Flexbox, and handling the initial selection. This is the example that we're going to create. The Select element is a native HTML element that you can use to create a drop-down menu. The DOM structure is there is a parent element called Select and many option elements within that. I'd like to show you how you can set up a menu so that it works with unidirectional data flow. I'll start by forking this mouse follower example, and I'll call it menu. Recall that this mouse follower example calls setState with the new position every time we move the mouse. The idea here is to do something similar when we select an option from a menu. But before we do any of that, we need to create this menu. Let's start by creating this top-level select element. That's quite similar to what we had before for creating the top-level SVG element. The only difference is that instead of creating an HTML element, we want to create a select element. And that does not have width or height. And I think I'll call that select element because the variable select is already in use. Next, let's create these option elements. I think I'll just make the same example as they have here in MDN, just as a simple test example of a menu. I'll start by pasting those elements here just as a reference. Notice that each of these options has a value and text that's inside of it. The value serves as a unique identifier, and the text in here is the human readable label that you'll see. The way I'd like to go about this is to define the data for this. I'll call it options data, and this can be an array of objects, each of which has a value, like dog, and a label, like uppercase D dog. We can make many of these entries and then fill them in from this example. So we got cat, hamster, parrot, spider, and goldfish. All right, now let's think about the problem of using D3 to create this DOM structure. We have our select element, and to create nested elements within that element, we can use the data join pattern. Select element dot select all option dot data options data dot join option. Now we want to set the value attribute. We can call .attr value, passing an accessor function that evaluates d.value. That would be these text strings here. And then to set the text of the element, we can say .text, passing a function that returns d.label. All right, now we have a working menu. The next challenge is to listen for changes. We can just Google search for this kind of thing and see what comes up. It looks like we can put an onChange listener on the top level select element. So let's try calling .onChange, defining a function that takes as input the event. And let's just console.log that event. If I select something, we get an event. And that event has a property called target, which is the select element. And that has a property called selected index. So let's console.log event.target.selected index. Now if I select, it says 1, 5, or 0, and we can use that to get at the actual object that was selected. For that, I'll move the declaration of options data up here. Now if we make a selection, it outputs the actual object. Also, we could use event.target.value, which will give us the value that we use as the ID for each option. At this point, we should think about what we want our state to look like. One way we could do it is have the entire object as a piece of our state. Another way we could do it is to just have the value as a piece of our state. Either way would work, but it's probably simpler just to put the value as part of our state. We can also start to think about componentizing this as well, because ideally our viz could have multiple menus and we wouldn't have to write out all this code for each menu. So I think what I'll do next is introduce a new file called menu.js. That way we can decouple all of this logic for the menu from the state management. I'll export a function called menu that takes a selection and some options. And then in viz.js we can import menu from /menu and invoke that on our container by saying container.call menu and some options. I think one property that we could put on this options object is this options data field. Now we can migrate all of this logic into menu.js. And I'll change it to use this variable called selection. And I'm realizing we don't actually need this variable because we can just chain this together like so. Okay, now we need to destructure options data from our options object. And instead of console.logging event.target.value, we can invoke onChange, which can be a callback function passed in on our options object. Now we have pretty much componentized this menu concept and decoupled it from our state management. Now when we invoke this from viz.js, we can pass in onChange to be a function that accepts the new value. And to see if it works, I'll just console.log value. Alright, let's see if this works. Okay, container.call is not a function. Right, I think that's a DOM element, so we need to say select container. Select is not defined in menu.js. Oh, but actually this is a selection already, so we don't need select. Okay, now if I make a selection in the menu, it works. It says hamster or parrot. Alright, now let's make this work with our unidirectional data flow. When we handle this change, we want to call setState and use an immutable update pattern that includes all the previous state, but also a new field called value. And it's pretty generic, but I think it's fine for now, and we can swap it out later as we introduce menus for actual things in visualizations. And I'll get rid of all this dead code. Alright, so now nothing gets logged. So we can verify that this is working by saying console.log state. State is initially an empty object, and then if we select something from the menu, it gets a value. And if we select something else, that value is updated. Alright, that's how you can create a basic menu with D3 and unidirectional data flow. I would like to clean this up though and make this bigger just to make this a reasonable looking example when you open it. Right now it's so tiny. One way we can do that is with CSS by setting font size to say 5 EM or 10 AM. That makes it pretty huge. But now when you select it, the options are massive. Oh, that's crazy. What about REM? Nope. I don't know, it's kind of tricky to style these things. Well, to wrap this up, I just want to maybe position this in the center so it doesn't look so awkward. We can do that using Flexbox on the body, setting it to full height, setting align items to center, which centers it vertically, and justify content also to center, which centers it horizontally. Okay, now it's centered. I would like to address one last issue, which is the initially selected item. Oftentimes we want to be explicit about which thing is selected initially. And right now it just defaults to the first thing in the list. Let's say we want the default value to be hamster instead of dog. Since state is initialized to be an empty object, we can check if state.value is defined, or rather if it's not defined. And in that case, we can set the state to have value of hamster. And since that will trigger a reevaluation of everything, we can just return and not execute any of the rest of that code. This does not work because our menu component doesn't actually know about the value. We can change that by passing in the value to be state.value, and then in menu.js, I believe we can set the value attribute of the select element to be value from our options object. That did not work. I think it might be property. No, that did not work either. Maybe we can only set that after all these options are set up. Let me try that. I'll go back to having a variable called select element. And then we can say select element.select all option. And then after all of that, we can say select element dot property value is value. Okay, now it worked. It set the initial value to hamster. All right, sweet. That is how you can set up a menu with D3 and unidirectional data flow. I'll do a quick recap of how all this works. We've defined this menu component that takes as input options data, onChange, and value. Options data is used to populate these option DOM elements. And options data is an array of objects, each of which has value, which is like the ID, and label, which is the human readable string. D.value gets mapped to the value attribute of these option elements. And D.label gets put as the text that shows up. A single top-level select element is provisioned, and we add an event listener onto that. When a user selects something from the menu, it calls onChange with the value of the selection option, and that value is one of these values here, defined as d.value. In viz.js, we invoke that menu component, passing in an onChange handler that sets the state to be whatever the previous state was plus value. And if state.value is undefined, which it is initially, we initialize it to be hamster. We also pass state.value as value on our options object for the menu which is set to be the property value on our top level select element. You could use this for all sorts of things like selecting what X and Y axes are or filtering the data. Sky's the limit, but that's basically how you set it up.